Greetings collectors and welcome to today's retro game review. Today we're returning to a long time ago and a console far far away, as we take a look back at the original Star Wars Rebel Assault on the Sega CD. If you're anything like myself, you will know the Star Wars saga inside out, its locations, characters and notable quotes. Star Wars has been part of the fabric of our culture for decades and has remained not only influential in the movie world, but the presence of its force has also been felt in the gaming industry. No stranger to the gaming world, LucasArts had numerous hits with series such as Monkey Island, Maniac Mansion, Sam & Max, Zack McCracken, Loom, Grim Fandango, amongst many others. Of course, being LucasArts, they were also sitting on potentially the largest franchise of all time, the rights to license the Star Wars brand. There had been Star Wars games before, but it was the creation of the original Rebel Assault that really looked to push the hardware of the day. Rebel Assault was released on the DOS PC, 3DO and the Sega CD, known as the Sega Mega CD here in Europe. Although technically the inferior edition, I've chosen to take a look at the Sega CD edition of Rebel Assault today. I grew up with the Sega consoles, so I'd like to relive some of that experience today. Rebel Assault is best described as a rail shooter. Most levels will have you flying along a predetermined path. Typically, you'll be in your X-Wing, either taking down the Empire's TIE fighters or destroying the enemy ground turrets. The premise of Rebel Assault is very much an alternative view of the events of A New Hope, set in the same time and universe. Rather than playing as Luke Skywalker, or any of the other key characters for that matter, you will take on the role of Rookie One. It's the classic setup of a small town boy joining the rebels to fight the Empire. It also gets around the need to use the original voice actors such as Mark Hamill. Overall, I didn't miss playing as Luke, as the story very much mirrors a similar storyline anyway. The game is split over 15 levels, but I'll give you the very shortened version of events here. You begin your journey in Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 with basic training. These cover the basic skills you'll need throughout the game. Chapter 1 sees you mastering basic control through a canyon landscape, whilst Chapter 2 sees you take your first steps into space itself in an asteroid field training mission. The training continues in Chapter 3 on the planet of Kalador. Here it's a case of more advanced control to avoid the harsh landscape.
Rookie 1, welcome to Kalador. This is Commander Rumor Lane. I'll be leading you through the last phase of your flight training. Any questions?
No, ma'am.
Good. You impressed Commander Farrell. That's not easy. Me, I'm a little more forgiving, but the course ahead isn't.
It's Chapter 4 though, where the game begins to find its feet. Until now, it's all been about the training, and if I'm honest, a little bit of game length padding. Chapter 4 though opens with the opening events of A New Hope. Leia must send the Death Star plans away with the droids to Tatooine, Vader closes in on Leia, and the rest of the plot writes itself. Your task is to attack the Star Destroyer above Tatooine by disabling its weaponry. It's obviously not a scene from the movie, but it is nice to finally get out there and take on the Empire head on.
Have you ever flown in...
Attention all pilots. Report to battle stations immediately. Tatooine base is under attack.
Well, kid, I think it's time you graduated to an X-Wing.
Chapter 5 focuses on a canyon-style chase on Tatooine itself. You must destroy the 3 TIE fighters before they alert the fleet to the presence of the rebels. There's a slight plot hole here, as I'm sure the TIE fighters could just radio this information back to base if needed. Chapter 6 sees you back in familiar territory, back in the asteroid field. Again, the reasons for this are a little thin plot-wise, and it is almost as if the developers were just attempting to pad out the game length with a cookie-cutter level from the training missions. Things take an unexpected turn in Chapter 7 though. That's right, we're off to fight Imperial walkers on an ice planet. As you'll appreciate, the Battle of Hoth doesn't take place until the Empire strikes back. However, it's such a great battle sequence I can totally forgive the developers for including a similar experience here in Rebel Assault.
Rookie 1, good to have you on board. Let's get this over with. Come to 513 Mark 4. Copy that.
Slightly more unforgivable though is the nature of the fight itself. Despite the knowledge that the armour is too thick to be penetrated by standard lasers, the method of taking down walkers is, well, you guessed it, shooting them down with standard lasers. I have to say though that I do enjoy this level. It looks and feels like Star Wars, so I'm more than willing to look over a few of these inconsistencies. It's at this point that we reach the halfway point of the game, and it's time to switch things up. Having been marooned after the Imperial Walker battle, Chapter 8 sees you in a freestanding shootout with stormtroopers. It's a case of working your way through the base and eliminating the barracks one stormtrooper at a time. It's somewhat of a shooting gallery feel and doesn't really push the Sega CD hardware as much as other areas of the game, but it is a nice change of pace and it is nice to be out on foot. The second half of the game really speeds the story along. You will go back to protecting rebel transports and off to Yavin to destroy armaments. Both of these levels play in a very similar way to the previous space and canyon levels.
No matter. Set course for the Death Star. We have the Princess. She's my link to finding their secret base.
In his continuing quest to locate the rebels, Darth Vader unleashes the immense destructive power of the Death Star on Alderaan, a peaceful planet sympathetic to the rebels, and home to Princess Leia.
By Chapter 11, the developers seem to remember that they had to tie in the storyline back to the main events of A New Hope. You'll be back out in space to destroy the oncoming waves of TIE fighters in an all-out dogfight, and then onto the Death Star surface missions.
Stay tight, here they come.
The Death Star surface mission is a nice change of pace, as you are treated to a slightly different camera angle as you take out Imperial gun turrets.
Okay, we can do this. Just keep your eyes open.
Chapter 14 culminates in a special mission to take out the power relays of some of the larger Imperial installations. It's a case of taking out the relays one shot at a time. Again, this is not necessarily in the movie, but it would fit in very well as a coherent strategy to draw attention away from Luke's bombing run on the Death Star. That brings us to the Death Star trench run itself, the final chapter of the game. It's that classic Star Wars scene of navigating at high speed through the Death Star's trench to allow that final shot that cripples the Empire. The game ends and Vader doesn't seem overly distraught about things, just mildly annoyed if anything.
You have defeated me. This time.
For a Sith Lord, he takes the whole destruction of the Death Star rather well in my opinion. Rookie 1 gets his medal and it's off for a well-earned mug of Jawa juice. So in terms of plot, Rebel Assault is a rather complimentary experience to the movie. It doesn't stray away too far from the classic storyline, but does enough to make you feel that you are part of the wider events in the conflict. You might be asking at this point, how is it to play? Well, sadly, I have to highlight a few issues with the game. Firstly, the elephant in the room that is the graphics. At the time, the Sega CD was championed by Sega for its in-game movie feel, an ability to deliver more graphically than the current 16-bit consoles. In truth, they were right. Sort of. Whilst parts of Rebel Assault look surprisingly good for its age, other elements seem quite flawed. It's clear that on the movie to CD transfer, the graphics have been heavily compressed. Some scenes seem to be particularly affected. In some ways, this detracts from having the movie-style execution in the first place. It's somewhere between animation and full motion. Scenes where Vader is giving instructions are also noticeably flawed, as only his head moves, very much like a bobblehead toy.
Your report, Commander.
We have them, Lord Vader. Within moments, our troops will board their ship. We'll then have the stolen plans back in our possession. And Princess Leia as well.
Excellent. I shall oversee her interrogation personally.
Where scenes have been animated rather than converted from the film, the overall effect is much more pleasing. In-game though is where I had the most issue with the graphics. The scene on Calador is just a mess. Whilst trying to avoid canyon edges and rock falls, the overall resolution and colour palette left me in some doubt as to what was actually happening. On top of this, the rather dubious frame rate just added to the overall playability issues. The control issues of the game manifested themselves in several ways. Firstly, that the Sega CD makes use of a traditional D-pad rather than a mouse. In some chapters, it is near impossible to move the crosshairs fast enough to accurately line up your shots. This is also particularly noticeable on the Yavin turret destruction level. The hopes of navigating your X-Wing whilst lining up the turrets is near impossible at times. I'll quite happily admit that I'm not always the best at rail shooters, but on occasions I thought that the shots I was making just went straight through the enemy. Overall, the game difficulty can become a source of frustration after a while. I'm certain that many Bothans died whilst trying to complete this one. In terms of a collectible, here is the UK edition for the Sega Mega CD. You get a nicely illustrated cover, CD and manual. Here in the UK, the Sega Mega CD used classic CD cases. The US edition of the game was issued in the long box format, but had the same illustrations on the cover and the manual. For the UK edition, a price anywhere between £10 and £20 is about right, although Star Wars collectibles tend to have a few pricing peaks and troughs, depending on what's happening around the release of the new movies. For the US edition, look to pay around the $10 mark, but a little more is worth an investment to get that particularly mint version of the game. So, Star Wars Rebel Assault for the Sega CD, is it worth collecting? In terms of the overall package, I'd personally have to say yes. The graphics and gameplay may be flawed, but there's more to the game than this. The cutscenes really add a nice interval to the game and ground the experience in a consistent feel to the original Star Wars universe. To aid this, the soundtrack is also ripped from John Williams' original score, and my impression is that quite a few of the sound effects are also direct transfers from the movie itself. The overall feel is one that this game was made by fans for fans. There is clearly a sense of authenticity to Rebel Assault despite the lack of original cast members. It does stray a little away from the classic storyline of A New Hope, yet at the same time not so self-indulgent that it breaks the feel of the franchise. It's also worth noting that Rebel Assault's original 1993 release date obviously predates the release of the prequel movies. It's also for this reason that it feels very grounded in the classic Star Wars universe that I knew when I was growing up. It's that slightly darker, grimier authenticity that many fans hold so dear. You won't see ninja-like lightsaber fights, hordes of CGI Gungans, or the mention of any of that nonsense to do with midichlorians in Rebel Assault. Rebel Assault is stripped back to that classic adventure formula that drew many of us to the franchise in the first place. At times, the execution of clunky controls and rather subpar graphics can make Rebel Assault much more difficult to play than it needs to be. In terms of execution, I can think of few similar games on the system that did the rail shooter genre better though. The developers were clearly passionate about Star Wars, and some of the cutscenes really are some of the best on the system. There really are a lot of positives about Rebel Assault if you can see it in context of the time it was released. It's for this reason that I'd hold Rebel Assault up as a game that wasn't afraid to adopt new technology and push the system as far as it could go. Sadly, it wasn't until the Star Wars Rogue Leader series on the Nintendo GameCube that a truly immersive Star Wars shooter caught my eye again. For an alternative retro dogfight, X-Wing vs TIE Fighter is also a title well worth looking out for. For the casual retro collector, Rebel Assault is a nice game to have if you can buy it at the right price, but it won't blow you away in comparison with the Star Wars shooters that came later in the series. Subsequent games have delivered more with a similar formula, making this title a little obsolete in the modern day. As for Star Wars fans though, Rebel Assault is clearly a collectible game. Add into the mix those collecting decent Sega CD games, this becomes a must-have title. The Force may not be as strong with this one as some had hoped, but it was a new hope for CD-based Star Wars games.
Okay, we're clear. Let's go.
Hello again, I hope you enjoyed today's show and thank you for the view. Remember, you can always comment, like, subscribe and find us on the social media sites below. Happy collecting!